6 of one, half a dozen of another. There's incredible.
Peter? Good evening. Welcome to AEI's pre-debate panel in Cleveland, Ohio. Debating the conservative heart, does the GOP care about people like me? My name is Marc Thiessen. I'm a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. As we get ready for the first Republican debate tomorrow, most of the GOP candidates have a problem, and it's not Donald Trump. The problem is this. Conservatives have the best solutions to the problems facing our country, from the problems of poverty to the problems of lack of opportunity and upward mobility. But Americans don't trust us to implement those policies because they believe that conservatives are heartless and don't care about people like them. One recent poll that Arthur mentions in his book tells the story in a nutshell. Found that 56% of Americans say the word compassion describes the Republican Party not very well at all, while just 5% say it describes the party very well. Think about that. Just 5% of Americans think that Republicans are compassionate. Worse still, most conservatives actually agree with that assessment. Arthur has a great story about a UCLA study in which they showed that in practice conservatives were just as generous as liberals when it came to helping people who were down and out. But when they asked conservatives and liberals whether the conservatives would be as generous, both said no. So the bottom line is conservative heartlessness is a myth, but most Americans, including most conservative Americans, actually buy the myth. To win in 2016, Republicans are going to have to turn that perception around and show the American people the compassion that is inherent in the conservative heart. And their first chances to do that is tomorrow night. Will they seize that opportunity? And if so, how can they do it? To answer those questions, we've assembled an amazing panel here today, starting with Arthur Brooks, who's the president of the American Enterprise Institute and the author of this new wonderful book, which I'm sure you all have. You have little booklets there from us, excerpts from it, The Conservative Heart: How to Build a Fairer, Happier, and More Prosperous America. Arthur has been described as the spiritual leader of the capitalist people. I count myself as a disciple. And The Conservative Heart is now in its second week on the top 10 of the New York Times bestseller list, moving up from number 9 to number 8, and we'll find out a little bit soon how it does the next week. But there's a reason for that. Conservatives are hungry to learn how we can show our heart so we can win the support of the American people and help struggling people with authentically conservative policies. Arthur's going to tell us how to do that, including 7 steps that the candidates on the debate stage tomorrow can take to show their conservative hearts. If there's one person in American politics who embodies the principles in Arthur's book, it is Ed Gillespie. I have known Ed for many years. We worked together in the Bush White House. He's one of the smartest, most principled conservative thinkers and strategists in the country. And it also turns out that he's a really, really good politician. In 2014, Ed ran an underdog campaign to unseat a very popular Democratic incumbent named Mark Warner. Nobody gave him a chance. The polls showed him down by double digits. He was vastly underfunded. But when the voting came, as we all remember on election night, he came within less than 1% of unseating this popular incumbent. Now, how did Ed manage to do what everybody said couldn't be done? He ran a hopeful, optimistic, positive campaign in which he showed his conservative heart to the voters of Virginia, and they rewarded him by almost making him senator. And if we had all rallied around him a little bit more, he would be Senator Gillespie today, but I'm sure there's a future there. So anyway, we're going to talk to Ed tonight and ask him about what was the secret of his campaign, how did he do so well, and what are the lessons from his experience that the candidates in 2016 that are going to be on the debate stage tomorrow can take to replicate his success. And finally, we're joined tonight by a rising star in the conservative political firmament, Kristen Soltis Anderson. Kristen is the co-founder and partner of Echelon Insights, an opinion research, data analytics, and digital intelligence firm. She's a columnist at the Daily Beast, co-host of a weekly podcast called The Pollsters, which she just recorded this afternoon from her hotel room, which is really cool. In 2013, she was named one of Time Magazine's 30 Under 30 Who Are Changing the World. And she's the author of a terrific new book called The Selfie Vote, Where Millennials Are Leading America and How Republicans Can Keep Up. She's the conservative movement's millennial whisperer. And so she's going to explain to us why millennials are tuning out the right and how we can get them to tune in. So thank you all for being here tonight. I'm going to start with Arthur. So Arthur, in your book, you identify this conservative paradox, which is that conservatives offer these great policies, but people are not listening to us because we don't effectively make our case to them. And you have a chapter called 7 Habits of Highly Effective Conservatives, where you explain how we can turn that problem around. So can you set up the problem for us and then explain the 7 steps that conservatives need to take to get people to listen to us?
Thank you, Mark, and thanks to all of you on behalf of all my colleagues at AEI. It's great. It's great to see you. We have a lot of friends here, supporters of the American Enterprise Institute, and some of you we haven't met before, and I'm looking forward to getting to know you. And AEI is really a service for ideas, to take the country forward in the world of ideas, but also to remind people why the ideas matter. What's the purpose behind our movement? What's the moral purpose behind our movement? Think tanks don't usually talk that way, but we do at AEI because we know the moral import of this moment. Not just what we're going to see tomorrow night, but what we're seeing at this point in American history. So I appreciate you coming tonight. And Mark set up the problem that we have. It is true that most Americans believe that there's a compassion gap in American politics today. This is of personal interest to me. I'm a conservative, a political conservative, because poverty is what I care about the most. Now, the fact that that sounds weird is a problem, that sounds unusual. I said that 2 months ago on stage with President Obama. There was a panel on poverty that kind of turned into a debate about poverty at Georgetown University, and that's what I said. I said, I'm a conservative because poverty is what I care about the most. And the president looked as if I'd suddenly switched into Mandarin or something. He didn't understand what I was saying. But it's true. I grew up in Seattle in a liberal family, which is basically redundant because there are like 8 Republicans in Seattle. So I thought what everybody thought, which is that if you care about poverty and you care about poor people and you care about vulnerable people, you're liberal. Conservatives don't care about those people. The conservatives might be good with money. They might be hard-headed politically. They might make good decisions when times are tough for the country, but you can't count on them to help the most vulnerable citizens. I harbored those views. I was relatively apolitical, but I always had these basically left-wing views because I cared about poverty a lot. This is what I saw around and in my world, and I was a musician. I'm all the way through my 20s after dropping out of college or getting kicked out, splitting hairs. I was working with and seeing and traveling around the world and experiencing a lot of this poverty, and it's alarming and it's troubling, and you want to vote for politicians and you want to see a political movement that cares about this. Well, I went to college in my late 20s, which was great because there was no brainwashing. There was just a stack of books in my living room. I was going to college by correspondence in my late 20s. And I decided I was going to find an answer to how you can stop poverty. And what I learned was truly shocking. I learned that the world's population living on $1 a day or less, starvation level poverty, had decreased since my childhood by 80%. Nobody knows this. It's like a state secret. An 80% decline in the world's worst poverty. And in looking for the reason why, I found it was not the United Nations or U.S. foreign aid. It was globalization and free trade and property rights and the rule of law and entrepreneurship. And it was the American free enterprise system. And furthermore, in keeping the Pacific Ocean free for trade and peaceful for the first time, it also required American military power. And when I started talking about the fact that these things had pulled 2 billion people out of poverty for the first time in human history since I was a child, and we needed to get the next 2 billion and the next 2 billion out of poverty, my friends said, "Oh, you're a right-winger." And after a while, I said, "I guess I am." And that's how I became a conservative, was because I cared about the real solution to poverty. I cared about the real solution to social justice problems in this country and around the world. And I wanted to be an advocate for what we could do for the least of these, our brothers and sisters, here and around the globe. And only free enterprise ideas, only American leadership can solve these problems. And when we walk away from them, we are inconvenienced, but people who are poor suffer the most, because they always suffer the most. That's why I realized I had to be a warrior for this cause. But there's a problem. And here's the problem. It's the problem that everybody up on the debate stage tomorrow night is going to be facing, especially when they get out onto the campaign trail. They're going to face the attitude that they don't care. See, the paradox of conservatism is that conservatives have the only ideas that can bring people out of poverty by the millions and billions, but they're the very people who are considered not to care. This is a bad paradox. And Marc gave you some of the data. Americans, when asked, are conservatives or Republicans compassionate? The answer is no, 11 to 1. You know, the only people who say yes are paid staff, the Republican Party, and blood relatives of politicians. And if you take those out, it rounds to 0 Americans who think that we care about it. That's, by the way, why Romney lost. There are always 3 questions that you ask in exit polling. Who's got better ideas, who's a better leader, and who cares more about people like you? Romney won on ideas. He won on leadership. He lost 80-20 on who cares more about people like you. You can't win if people think you don't care. We can regret that. We can say that's stupid. You're going to lose. If the Republicans don't fix this now, it doesn't matter what happens on the debate stage tomorrow night. It doesn't matter. They're going to lose in 2016. They don't stand a chance. Hillary Clinton's going to be president, or somebody else if she blows up, you know, Bernie Sanders or Martin O'Malley or somebody else you haven't heard of. Somebody will be president besides a Republican. This has to be solved. It's not, caring is not something that can win. It's the only thing that will. So how are you going to do it? That's why I wrote the book. I wrote the book to talk about what conservatives need to do to be able to express the truth about what's written on our heart and the truth about what we can do with our ideas. And if we do that, victory will come not for us, but for the people who need it the most. So how do you do it? And Marc referred to the last chapter of the book, which is called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Conservatives. Really hackneyed, but I'm trying to get a little bit of attention with it. Where did it come from? It came from the debate training techniques that at AEI we have developed over the past 7 years to work with members of Congress, for their TV appearances, for their town hall meetings, and certainly for their debates. And it's the first time that we've opened this up to the general public. So these are the real things that we talk about. And I'm not going to go through all 7. It would take too much time. But let me tell you kind of what it comes down to. The first is making sure that we have our own conversion of heart. And this is what, for those of you who are political conservatives, which is not all of you, I suspect, but some of you, that you would, if you're a political conservative, that you would ask, that you would do, I would say, as an examination of conscience. And this is something that we do at the American Enterprise Institute, that I ask my colleagues to do. And it's this: before you go to sleep tonight, ask yourself, did all of my policy work go for the benefit of people with less power than me? If the answer is no, you're screwing up and you're going to lose. If the answer is yes, get a good night's sleep. Come back ready to fight, because it's a noble fight and it actually can win. That's the first thing. The second is, how do we change our attitude about the most vulnerable people? The biggest problem that we have in American society today is that it doesn't matter if you're a liberal or a conservative. Poor people, they're the other. We don't live near them. We don't know them. And when they're the other, you treat them like liabilities to manage. That's how we see poor people. Liberals manage those liabilities with vast amounts of government money. Conservatives manage those liabilities with the criminal justice system. But when poor people are liabilities to manage, nobody's going to treat them with the dignity, with the respect that they actually need to become full citizens with full human rights. For that, they have to be seen as assets to develop, not liabilities to manage. To be a good conservative, you have to look at everybody. Who does that mean? That means poor people and kids, babies, unborn babies, elderly people, immigrants, the disabled, liberals, minorities, everybody as assets to develop, not as liabilities to manage. Can you do that? We have to answer that in the right way. Third, we have to deploy our conservative policies. This is not compassionate conservatism, which was kind of liberalism administered 5% more efficiently than leftists do. That's not what I'm talking about. This is authentic conservatism deployed with a preference for the poor. In other words, when we talk about entrepreneurship, this is not about tax advantages for billionaires. This is about pushing opportunity and entrepreneurship all the way down to the bottom of the people who don't have an education, who are poor, who are marginalized, and don't speak English. That's what these principles are all about, touching the people who need it the most. And all our arguments, and this is the most important one of all, is not fighting against things, but fighting for people. See, the conservative weakness in a nutshell is that we fight against things. We fight against Obamacare. We fight against teachers' unions. We fight against deficits and debt and taxes. We shouldn't do that. We should fight for the people who are hurt by Obamacare and the people who need good schools and the people who should be able to start businesses without punitive taxation and regulation and our children and grandchildren who should not be saddled with debt that's unfair because we're frittering away their future. We should fight for people in every case and not fight against things. Look, if we do this, we're going to win. And here's why it matters the most before I turn it over to Ed. I believe, looking at the data, and data is what I do. I'm the president of a think tank, and I suffered through a PhD in quantitative analysis for a reason. And when I look at the data, I can tell you this is what it says. Americans are truly a center-right body. And they're looking for an excuse to vote for conservatives. They're saying, just give me an excuse. And we're not giving them an excuse. See, everybody has to go to their Thanksgiving table, just like me. And at the Thanksgiving table, you're talking to somebody who's really left-wing, and that really left-wing person says, how come you guys hate gays? How come you guys hate poor people? Why are you guys against women? And look, I can answer that. Everybody in this room can answer that. But Americans need an answer for that. Give them an excuse to vote like we vote. Give them an excuse to do what they need to do to bring this country back and to make it strong and to fight for everybody. The way we're going to do that is by fighting for people and the people who need us the most. The excuse is a message of optimism, of aspiration, and of opportunity. So the question I'll leave you with is, are we going to see that aspiration, opportunity, that message, that excuse for America tomorrow night or not? Thank you.
So Ed, in the book, Arthur tells the story of Indianapolis Colts quarterback Andrew Luck. I know that's unpopular to say here, but in addition to his great skill on the football field, he's become famous for congratulating enthusiastically and sincerely any player who hits him hard.
Nice hit.
He literally goes up and says, "Nice hit." And he's the quintessential happy warrior. And you're the happy warrior of Virginia politics. So tell us, how did you craft a campaign that was so optimistic, so hopeful, didn't give in to the desire to bash and to be angry, but was hopeful and optimistic, and why did Virginia voters respond to that?
Well, thank you for that. And as Arthur said, we do have a tendency to run against things. I wanted to run for what we're for and for the people that needed our policies and benefit from our policies. And one of the great things about the campaign for me was a fantastic experience. And I knew at the beginning of the campaign in concept who I was fighting for. But by the end of the campaign, I knew them by name. And I would talk about them by name. And I still know the names of many of the people. But Ron from Richlands, which is right outside of Bristol, Virginia, coal country, laid off coal miner, about my age, 3 children like I have, and he's now mowing lawns and doing odd jobs, there's dignity in all work, and I respect him immensely. He's providing for his family, but he's making about a quarter of what he was making in the coal mines, and that's a result of their policies, of the policies that my opponent had supported. Linda from Chesapeake had lost her eye specialist because of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, and she was suffering as a result of that, literally suffering as a result of it, and I wanted to fight for her and had a positive way to replace the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, not just repeal it. Lindsay from Roanoke University had been graduated a double major in economics and finance, and she was working at the mall because she couldn't find a job commensurate with her degree because of the Obama economy. And so I was fighting for those folks, and I talked in terms of the benefits of our policies. One of the things I think Republicans make a mistake is we talk too much in terms of process. And we can all, think of Republicans who would say, I want to cut taxes and repeal Obamacare and approve the Keystone XL pipeline. What I said is, I want to create jobs, raise take-home pay, lift people out of poverty, hold down healthcare costs, and reduce energy prices. the policies that I supported to do that were those things that others talk about in terms of process, but we need to talk in terms of the benefit. And, as Arthur said, the fact is the candidate, not just tomorrow night, but throughout the course of this campaign, I believe the nominee who emerges from this very vast field will be one, and who will win next November is the candidate who not only makes the economic argument for our policies, but the moral case for our policies. And people are hungry to hear that. And, the fact is we have a very strong indictment of, and you can see it in the real world, the effects of the liberal policies that we've seen over the past 7 years. We need to make that case against those policies, but we have to put forward a positive economic agenda. I had a 5-point agenda for economic growth, and I took that agenda everywhere. It was a message that resonated in every segment of the electorate in every corner of the Commonwealth, and I went to every segment of the electorate in every corner of the Commonwealth. I was in homeless shelters and food banks and drug rehab clinics, and went to a lot of places a lot of Republicans haven't gone in Virginia in a long time. I was in black churches and Korean festivals, Vietnamese New Year's. My campaign literature was translated into 7 different languages. And I was in those communities and I was welcomed in those communities, but you can't go into those communities with a negative attitude and message, a positive message like I just talked about, and solutions and answers. People are hungry for that. I think they're hungry for that in the core of the Republican Party, and I know they are hungry for it amongst persuadable voters, a lot of independent voters and soft Democrats. And I would say, in Kristen's book, as she notes, millennials are looking for that kind of positive message, hope and optimism, an inclusive campaign. And young people were a very important part of my campaign. I had very strong support from college Republicans and young Republicans, young professionals. I would always joke when I was meeting with the college Republicans, especially early on in the campaign, I would finish after visiting with them and I would say to them, and I promise you this, I will not make it any harder for you to be a college Republican than it already is. And they always appreciated that, and they knew the kind of campaign I was going to run, and they wanted to be part of that campaign, and they were an energetic part of that campaign. So I believe, to a certain extent, when you look back, to me, one of the highest compliments I got after the campaign was from someone who said, your campaign reminded me of Jack Kemp. And to Arthur's point, Jack Kemp used to say about the voters, they don't care what you know until they know that you care. And I do think it's very important for us to make that point. I think we have a great opportunity in this election in particular, because one of the reasons that Secretary Clinton is so vulnerable as a Democratic nominee, if she ends up with the Democratic nomination, you're seeing it now in the numbers. It's not just the honest and trustworthy numbers where she's upside down. She's upside down on cares about people like me, which is unique for a Democrat who is certainly as well known as she is. And we have an opening here, and we need to take advantage of it. And I'm confident that we will. You can feel it, I think, coming slowly but surely, rising out of the intra-party debate that we're having, the outline of what I think is going to be a very positive agenda that really addresses the needs. And I'll just conclude with this. One of the things that we have to do, and that I tried to do in my campaign, was to address the needs and the concerns of the working poor, who are really, really getting hammered in this economy. And if you spend any time with them, as I did in the course of my campaign, we need policy. We have policy solutions that will help them. But if you're in the second quintile, a household with an income between $20,000 and $40,000 per year, your wages are stagnant, your hours have been cut back, the prices for food and health care and energy has been better of late, college, you're getting hammered. And that's a result of their policies, and our policies would improve their lives, but we need to make that case, and I'm confident that we will. So I'm thrilled to be here. Let me just say, too, AEI is, I think the most consequential on the right think tank that we have. I have respect for a lot of the others, but I am constantly on their website, constantly getting great ideas from Arthur. And so I don't say that just to suck up to the host of this forum. Not that I'm above that kind of thing. But it has the added benefit of being true, and I'm thrilled to be here and be a part of it. Thank you all for coming, and thanks for letting me be with you.
So, Kristen, if we're going to take advantage of the opportunity that Ed just laid out, we've got to win over the millennials. You wrote in your book, and this is a quote, "I've spent the last 6 years trying to crack the code of young voters, and what I have found should terrify Republicans." That's terrifying. Why should we be terrified, and what can we do to help ourselves?
So I want to thank you for being here and let you know that I hopefully my answer will leave you less terrified than that quote does. There's in the course of the last couple of years, I have spent a lot of time on the road talking to voters my age. I am someone who is on the younger side of things for the conservative movement, and when I first began getting interested in politics, it was weird that I was interested in politics. When I was 16, 17, 18 years old, and I was first, becoming politically aware, my friends thought that was odd, that I was the debate team kid. As I went to college, though, and after I graduated, I noticed that it was no longer weird that I was interested in politics. A lot of my friends began getting very engaged in the process, excited about the candidacy of this senator from Illinois named Barack Obama. No longer was it weird that I was interested in politics. Instead, the sentence I kept hearing was, "How can you be Republican? You seem so nice and normal." That suddenly my political leanings were what made me unusual for someone my age. And this concerned me deeply. It concerned me that when a friend of mine came out to me as gay, that he said he was nervous because he knew that he and I had been friends forever, but he knows that I'm Republican, and so he was just kind of nervous that I might judge him. That stuck with me, and I thought to myself, we need to fix this. So I've spent the last number of years conducting research, surveys, and focus groups of my generation, and what I have found should terrify Republicans, it should terrify conservatives if we don't do anything about it. The challenge is that when I go around the country and I talk about this, the number one statement, if I had $1 for every time I heard this sentence, I would be a very rich lady, is, well, isn't it that when you're young, if you're young and conservative, you have no heart, and you're old and liberal, then you have no brain? And people always say it with kind of a laugh. Well, first of all, it's incredibly untrue. The data doesn't support it at all. Most people don't remember that as recently as the 2000 election, George W. Bush polled as well with young voters as he did with senior citizens. Both Al Gore and George W. Bush split the youth vote, and they split the senior citizen vote. This generational polarization is a relatively new phenomenon. Second, there's no reason to believe that people will naturally just become conservatives as they get older. Certain generations have, in large part because the political events when they were young, there were big shifts when they were first becoming politically aware. And if you actually look at the data, folks that were born during the Reagan era to this day are more likely to be more Republican than those who were born before or after them. And many of the factors that lead someone to perhaps become more conservative, getting married, going to church on Sunday, having kids, living in more of a rural area, a lot of these demographic trends, the winds are not blowing conservatives' way. So the idea that all of a sudden all of these young people will suddenly have kids and get married and begin paying taxes and magically one day wake up as conservatives, I think is a dream. And that's a dream that I don't think is going to come true. But in thinking about this sentence, if you're young and conservative, you have no heart, and you're old and you're liberal, you have no brain. I think the thing that has really gotten under my skin the most about that in the last few years is the idea that if you are young and conservative, you would have no heart. Why would that be the case? And why do so many on our side often even use that sentence as a joke? It's conceding a point that I don't think we need to, and it's why I'm so excited that Arthur wrote the book that he did. I think that the reason why we need to focus on winning young voters, though, is not just about scoring wins at the ballot box. I think it's because by paying attention to the millennial generation, those born in the 1980s and the 1990s, it helps keep us focused, not just on what our principles are, but how we can apply our principles to the challenges of the modern economy to lead to better outcomes for people of all types, of all ages, of all races, of all economic statuses. I loved what Ed had to say, and I actually put stars on my notes here about this idea that we love on the right to talk about process. and that when we talk about process, we're missing the point. I conducted a focus group in San Diego, California, where I asked my respondents a number of questions. I said, and these were all young Obama voters who were winnable. And I said, do you think that the government spends too much money? And to a person, they all said yes. Do you think that there's too much regulation? And they all kind of nodded, yeah, probably. Do you think that we're in too much debt? Absolutely. Do you think taxes are too high? They generally nodded along with that. And then I said, do you think the government is too big? And they all stared at me like I had just asked some question in another language. The government is too big. What does that even mean? I guarantee you tomorrow night you are going to hear the phrase big government 1,000,000 times. And that's not an exaggeration. And I think what's so frustrating is when we focus on big government and the specter of big government, that is inherently kind of a process argument. We may think of it as an outcome. Shrinking government is an outcome. But what is the outcome to an individual? What is the outcome to a person? How does smaller government make someone's life better? And I fear that on the right, we have failed to make the argument of how our policies can make young people's lives better. We talk about low taxes. We talk about less spending. We talk about cutting government. But we don't always make the connection to the outcome. And where that really gets us into trouble then is on the question of motive. So if all we talk about is process and we don't explain why the things we believe in will lead to better outcomes for the people that we're talking to, then we can't just say, well, I promise I care. I promise I care. We can't just say it. It's the sort of thing that I think it's important for us to say, but it will only be credible if we are demonstrating why our policies aren't just things that in the abstract may seem good, or why it's things that will make the Dow go up, or why it's things that will perhaps lead to maybe the government debt going up a little less quickly. Instead, I think we need to be making the argument for why our policies lead to better outcomes for people who have no idea why free markets or limited government actually would make their lives better. We should be talking about the ways in which we can, what we believe can unleash the sort of prosperity that can help everyone out and help everyone achieve their dreams. In a survey that I just conducted of women in the state of Ohio, we actually just released today, I tested two different messages about economic growth and entrepreneurship and business leaders. And these two messages, one was about supporting job creators. Do you agree or disagree that we should support job creators rather than punishing them with taxes and regulation? And then the other position that I tested was, do you believe we should make it easier do you agree or disagree? We should make it easier for people to start their own businesses and be able to work from home and have more flexible careers. Something that sounds a little more personable and that sounds a little more like the way people might talk to their friends rather than sort of political talking points. And it should come as no surprise that the message about supporting job creators came in about 20 to 30 points lower than the message about helping people find opportunity and start their own business. This shouldn't be surprising, and yet so often we find ourselves defaulting to kind of the language that we're comfortable with and the message that we're comfortable with. So I want to close on this. The idea that right now voters of all types, they believe that politicians across the spectrum, regardless of their beliefs, are inauthentic, that they don't care. As Ed mentioned, we are now sort of on the right have been given this gift to where people, and it's an unfortunate gift, but this gift in that people now look at politicians and leaders on both sides of the aisle across the political spectrum and think none of them care. So the opportunity is now great for us to begin trying to pierce that negative view. And particularly with young voters, they are a generation that just tunes out the negative ads, that tunes out the bashing, that tunes out the things that so often our political leaders are used to saying. And the idea of having someone who they're not focused on the ideological win, even if the things they stand for are deeply rooted in an ideology that is very principled. Most young voters are very pragmatic in nature. They want people to talk about how they're going to solve problems and make people's lives better. And it seems so simple, but it's unfortunately not something that a lot of our leaders do. So in conclusion, I think that folks on the right should be nervous because unfortunately we have failed to make the argument up to this point to my generation why free markets actually lead to better outcomes to people and why someone can have pure and good motives for believing in the free market. And I think solving that problem is absolutely essential, not just to winning elections tomorrow and to getting our ideas implemented and to being able to govern effectively, but for the long haul. Someone who turns 18 on the eve of the next presidential election in 2016, based on average life expectancy, will continue voting until the presidential election of 2076. That is an awful lot of votes. Thank you.
We're live streaming this event, so if you're out there watching this on live stream and if you have a question for any of the panelists, go to Twitter and ask your question using the hashtag #ConservativeHeart, and they'll send it up to us to the panel to ask. Let me start off the questioning with Arthur. So we hear all the time, stop talking about the advice to Republicans, stop talking about morality and focus on economic issues. And you say in the book that conservatives are not moralistic enough. There's this paradox where liberals are actually materialists, but speak in moralist terms, and conservatives are actually moralists, and we end up speaking in materialistic terms. And so, when did we start talking like economics professors, and how do we fix it?
Well, it is true that the economic, or I should say, the political irony of our time is that when you talk to progressives about how to fix poverty, for example, or virtually any issue, they'll talk about spending government money. Now, if anybody thinks that spending money from the government is the best way to wipe out poverty, you haven't been paying attention since May 22nd, 1964. One day after I was born, by the way, when Lyndon Johnson gave his Great Society speech and kicked off a $15 trillion cascade of cash that moved the poverty rate from 15% all the way to 14.7% today. That was a failure that would have gotten any CEO in America fired 500 times over for. So cash is not the issue. Yet that's how progressives typically talk about that particular problem. Yet they dress it up as if it were about compassion and fairness. And I actually believe progressives do have compassion and a sense of fairness toward the poor. But when you're fundamentally a materialist, but you're dressed up like a moralist, you can do an awful lot of good politically for your own side. Now, on the other side, who are we? We're moralists. Fundamentally, you talk to conservatives and they get all choked up talking about the autonomy of the individual, the great entrepreneur, the dignity of work. Yet we wrap ourselves in materialistic language of GDP growth and of regulation and of big government and of deficits and debt. So you have materialists that look like moralists and moralists that look like materialists, and Americans are not getting what they want. They want moralists who sound like moralists. And what that means is that we need to have our authentic conservative morals, and morals are not just the instrumentalized morals about social issues. No. We're talking about the true morality of compassion and fairness as we define it, not redistributive fairness, meritocratic fairness, rewarding people for their hard work and personal responsibility, which is what brought virtually all of your families to this country, was actually being able to get that for the first time, which, by the way, is the reason that capitalism is a true part of American social justice, something that Europeans and South Americans just don't understand. So we have to use this language of compassion and fairness. Every answer about public policy should have some reflection or should be centrally around compassion and fairness, because those are the moral dimensions that everybody shares. There's a lot of research on this. My great friend Jonathan Haidt, who's a social psychologist at New York University, he does work on what he calls moral taste buds. And he says that the dimensions of morality that everybody shares are compassion and fairness. And then conservatives have these additional dimensions of fairness. They're not more moral than liberals, but they have more morals than liberals, is what he says. And it's authority and purity and loyalty and law and order and all this kind of stuff. But forget that. Let's think what we all have in common is compassion and fairness. If you use the language of compassion and fairness, you will win because you're talking about what people care about the most. Yet that's what conservatives are so worried about doing. They've gotten scared off the whole idea of morality. They need to remember what true morality is and then not be afraid to actually use it. It took me a long time to throw off my chains, by the way. As an economist, it took me a long time to talk about the moral case for the free enterprise system. But once you start to see the effect, and people can come around, and I can talk about this on college campuses, and then people will give it a listen, and they'll have a little bit of openness, and then actually magic can happen.
Ed, you took that message to non-traditional communities, as you started to say in your opening, and you had enormous success. You got 10% of the black vote. second only to Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina. He got 15% of black males, which is just remarkable for a Republican candidate. 50% of the Asian vote. I mean, so you've taken this message of optimism to non-traditional communities and had success. How did you do it, and how can more Republicans do the same thing?
Well, I had a positive agenda that did resonate in these communities. I also have a personal story that I was relatable in these communities because of my own family history. My father is an immigrant to this country, and he was brought here as a boy from Ireland at the age of 8 because his father, my grandfather, found work in America as a janitor. And my grandfather was a night janitor. He would go into a big bank building in Philadelphia at 6 o'clock after the bank closed. And over the course of an 8-hour shift, starting on the ground floor, emptying the wastebaskets, mopping the floors, he would work his way up floor by floor by floor to the top story. My parents did not have the benefit of a college education, two of the smartest people I've ever known and two of the hardest working, and I grew up in their grocery store. They insisted I go to college, and my brothers and sisters do the same. We were first generation on either side of the family, and I got to grow up. Marc and I worked together in the White House. I was counselor to the President of the United States of America, from immigrant janitor to West Wing of the White House in 2 generations' time. And my point was that kind of economic opportunity and upward mobility that I've experienced in my life and in my family history, I want to make sure every family and everywhere has that same kind of opportunity for upward mobility. And so I would go into the communities, like I said, and I translated my material and my platform into these languages. And it wasn't just the language. A lot of the people I gave the Korean language brochure to spoke English, but it was the body language. We had taken the time to translate it into Korean and Vietnamese and Tagalog, Spanish. And so that was part of it. It was going into those communities and also listening. And I will tell you that in many meetings with black pastors and leaders in the African American community, they changed my perspective on criminal justice issues. And Kristen talks about this in her book in terms of the Millennials. And so on mandatory minimums and some other things, I felt that we needed to revisit those policies and take a fresh look. And so I put forward policies that responded to that. And then the last thing I would say is education reform and the opportunity for quality, safe, good schools, good public schools in every community. And so having that kind of positive agenda and going places, like I say, that for too often I think we've allowed the Democrats to take for granted and Republicans have written off, that changed the dynamic considerably. And frankly, it made for a much more enjoyable and fun campaign.
So, Kristen, I'm going to start with you, and I'd like everybody to answer this question. But you were on ABC This Week on Sunday, and you were talking about how there's only going to be, most Americans are only going to see a few moments of tomorrow night's debate. And those moments can be about one of two things. They could be about Donald Trump, or they could be about our vision for the future of the country. And so, we're obviously going to have some Trump moments. A lot of people are tuning in for that. But what moments do you want people to take away from the debate tomorrow night? What moments if our candidates are successful, what are the moments that we're looking for?
In an ideal world, I would love for a candidate to be able to succinctly make the case that the grand old party is actually the party of what's new. That right now voters are so frustrated with the status quo. And too often, I think we on the right are allowed to be painted as the movement that is the movement of what's old, the movement of what's in the past. And I don't think that that's what voters are hungry for right now. I think they are forward-looking, they are nervous about the future, but ultimately it's in the DNA of this country to believe that the future ought to be brighter, that our next generation ought to be better off. So I'm looking for someone who can make the case that they stand for something that is very forward-looking. If you think about the issues that Ed just brought up, whether it's criminal justice reform, whether it's education reform, in sector across sector of our economy and our nation, the defenders of the status quo are often on the left. The defenders of systems that are not working, that are not lifting people out of poverty, that are not giving people opportunity, that are throwing up roadblocks to opportunity. It is not typically the right that is the defender of those roadblocks and of those systems that have been shown not to work. And so I'm looking for somebody who can make the case in a way that will actually get the networks to show the clip, which may be the most difficult part of all, show the clip after the debate as one of the highlights. That's the message that I'm hopeful we can get across. Not just because I think it will appeal to young people, I think it will appeal to all Americans.
Arthur, what do you want to see in the debate tomorrow?
We're in what economists would call it politically in the United States a suboptimal equilibrium, where things are in an equilibrium, so it's sort of a stalemate, but it's no good. It's competing pessimisms right now. And the reason for that, I mean, the great disappointment of the current era in politics, in my view, is not that Barack Obama got elected president. Some of you voted for him. The problem is that he campaigned on optimism and unity, and he has absolutely, he has governed on pessimism and division. And that pessimism and division has bred a pessimistic, divisive opposition, and that's what you see in Republican politics today. In point of fact, we have an envy party and an angry party in the United States today, and neither one of them is any good at all. That's what most people think. So what I want to see tomorrow is an example of one or two or a bunch of political candidates, aspirants for president of the United States, that are going to be true leaders, breakout leaders. See, politicians can act like leaders, but they're actually followers. If you look at conservative voters today, they're frustrated, they're angry, they're fearful. Why? Because they see lawlessness, they see chaos, they see problems in the United States. They're getting worse and are not getting solved. And so they're very angry about this. And a political candidate who looks at that and becomes a cipher for that anger and frustration and fear is a follower, is not a leader. A leader takes that frustration and fear and anger and pivots it to aspiration and says, I see the better future to solve these problems, follow me. That's what a great breakout leader does. That's what Ronald Reagan does. Read Peter Wollaston's book on Ronald Reagan. You'll see that very clearly. He was a breakout leader who turned anger and fear into aspiration. And are we going to see that from 4 or 5 of them tomorrow night? I sure hope so.
Ed?
Yeah, I would agree with both those things. I mean, you know, we have to make clear that we do not have to accept stagnant wages and reduced working hours and chronic unemployment, long-term unemployment, as the new normal. The new normal is the old mediocre, and we can do better with the right policies and putting forward those policies. And again, I think addressing the concerns of the non-college educated working poor, which our policies do, that not only resonates with non-college educated working poor, it resonates with, you know, college educated voters and the middle class and others as well. And you know, standing up for those folks and putting forward that positive agenda in the way that Arthur talked about in his 7 points. I hope to hear some more of that tomorrow night.
The one thing that I want to add, and I think the way that the vision we have just described here winds up making an impact and being a moment that the media will carry forward, will have to mean that it is conveyed through a story. I think we too often talk talking points, we talk bullet points, we talk graphs and charts, but we're not as good at storytelling. And I think those are the things that people remember, the anecdotes, the painting the picture of the person and how they are affected by something. I think in order for this kind of optimistic message to really break through the noise that I think is unfortunately potentially going to be the wake of this debate, I think it's got to be a story.
Okay. We have a question from Twitter. From BBI LLC, who wants to know, he wants some details. I don't know if it's he or she. What kind of plans do we have to help low-income families and individuals looking for jobs, both across the country and here in Cleveland?
Well, I'll take a couple. You know, one, and I'm neutral in this race, but one of the things that I embraced in my campaign, because there was a lot of discussion about having a federally mandated increase in the minimum wage, and we still see this debate going on quite a bit. And you know, Arthur has written extensively on this, but the best estimate of the job loss that would come from the proposed minimum wage increase was 500,000, probably 1 million jobs lost. And my point is, I don't think that we help the working poor by making more of the working poor the unemployed poor. Because there is dignity in all work, and we need to have more of our fellow Americans have that dignity. At the same time, the non-college educated working poor are struggling, and if you are supporting a family on a minimum wage, you can't do that. We need to help folks. And so I favored and supported a tax credit refundable tax credit, a work or a wage enhancement or work incentive tax credit that would come, it would be like if you get paid every 2 weeks, you would get a third paycheck essentially. That would help you make ends meet. And as you increased your wages because you got more hours or you got a promotion, new job, then that would come down. But that would not disincentivize work, but it would meet the concerns the legitimate concerns that people have. But that doesn't create more opportunities. I do think we need to create more opportunities as well, and there are a lot of policies, in particular in the energy sector, that would help us if we unleashed more domestic energy. Those are high-paying jobs that don't often require a college education. So there are things we can do in the energy sector. And then, of course, in healthcare, where the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, is a huge drag on employment and wages, and increasing costs for out-of-pocket for deductibles and copays as well. So I had, like I say, a positive agenda. I think we Republicans need to put forward a positive agenda, and education reform has to be a part of that, and not just college education. Although it is increasingly true that if your parents didn't go to college, you don't go to college. I'm becoming more and more of an exception to be first generation. We need to break that pattern. But I think education reform is a huge key for upward mobility.
Education reform clearly is something that has to happen so we don't keep repeating this cycle every 15, 20 years. And if we do education reform now, we will reap the benefits for generations to come. And we're not just talking about kids, by the way. Real education reform should look at people as assets from the time that they're babies until the time that they're retired. And so real education reform talks about vocational and technical education at the high school and community college level. It talks about worker retraining. It talks about early childhood development. It talks about the reduction of unionization so that we can have more choice and innovation in K through 12. It talks about gifted and talented programs, all of that stuff. You have to be a total futurist if you don't want to keep having this problem for the next 20 and 30 and 40 and 100 years in this country, and if you want the United States to continue to lead the world. In the more immediate term, Ed was referring to a policy that he was talking, wage subsidies are actually really interesting. The biggest problem that we have on the right is anytime that your left-wing friend says, why don't you think America should get a raise? Do you think that it's easy to live on $7.25 an hour? And of course the answer is no. And we have to start with the moral proposition that if you work hard and play by the rules, you deserve to be able to support yourself and support your family. And so you can't just be against the minimum wage. And you should only ever be against the minimum wage because it destroys jobs for the most vulnerable citizens, which is, practically speaking, we're talking about minority communities without a high school education with the most tenuous grasp on the workforce, the most vulnerable people in our society. And so what you need is a better policy than that. And the right policy is this, or what we would call the earned income tax credit, an expansion of that to single men with non-custodial care of their kids. It's astonishing that we still have these policies that you can get it if you're a woman and you got kids, but you can't get it if you're a man because, these are the most... single men who have non-custodial care of their kids are the most unlovable people in our population, apparently. Yet these are the people who are most at risk. Look at all the crises that we see in our country today. You should be scandalized, in my view, when you look at Ferguson, Missouri, not because of any lawlessness, but because there's 33.2% unemployment in the African-American community in Ferguson, Missouri. That's an opportunity civil rights nightmare, and we should all feel terrible about it and have some sort of a solution to it, and that's one way. And then the second is for people who are actually thrown out of work. One of the worst developments in American society is the rigidity in our workforce. If you look back 100 years into your own family, you're going to find migration. My own family migrated. They were just riffraff, and they were getting thrown out of work or in jail or something every generation. So they kept moving west until they finally got to Seattle and they had to stop because it was like after that it was nothing, it was boats or something. So, so why don't we think that way anymore? We have 12 million Americans on permanent disability in this country, and most permanent disability, we understand, is permanent unemployment that's off the rolls on the basis of a diagnosis of depression and back pain, because people in small towns in Kentucky, for example, can never find a job again and they're 55 years old. Why is it that there's no migration in this country? Why are we not facilitating that kind of migration? And I'll give you an example of how this would work. Look at North Dakota. 10 years ago, 43rd in state GDP per capita. Today, number 2. It was When you look at the unemployment rate, one of the highest in the country, lowest today, 2.3% unemployment. Walmart, to stock shelves in the Bakken Shale in North Dakota, pays $17 an hour to start. Why aren't people moving there? Why isn't there more information? Why aren't we helping people to pull up stakes? Do we care that much that people stay in their homes? We have to think creatively about it. So we need human capital development. We need government policy through the tax system that actually creates higher wages. And we need ways to improve the information such that we can be an American society that's mobile as we've always been in the past.
The one that I'll add, and I hope it doesn't seem like it's too small potatoes, is the idea of sort of regulatory and licensing reform. So an example that I talk about in my book is that in 2012, President Obama was giving an interview on MTV in the West Wing, or in the Oval Office, pardon me, and he was asked by this MTV VJ, Mr. President, lots of young people nowadays look at Mark Zuckerberg as somebody they'd like to be like. What have you done as president to make it easier for a young person to start their own business, be their own boss, and build a company? And I'm kind of cynical, and I'm sitting back on my couch, and I'm like, oh, I'm interested to see what he says to this. And his response was amazing. His response was, we took a look at the regulations that were on the books, and we saw that small investors, people who didn't meet this particular threshold for how much money they had, couldn't invest in their friends' companies, using the internet. So we repealed this regulation so that people can now do crowdfunding. You can have Kickstarter. So if you've got an idea and you want to try to raise a little bit of money, we repealed the regulations that were preventing you from doing that. And my jaw dropped. I thought that is a conservative idea. That is a getting government out of the way of people building their own futures and own opportunities idea. And of course, it was a bill that had come out of Congress with bipartisan support, but more support from one party than the other. And, to the president's credit, he signed it, but this was not something that conservatives should have been silent about. We should have been championing this as a great victory and as something that we were doing to implement our values and better let the market help people achieve their dreams. And so I think it's whether it's examples like those kinds of regulations that get in people's way, or something as simple as why does it take a huge test to become a florist in certain states, or why are there huge regulatory burdens if you want to drive a commuter van, or be somebody who provides manicures. Across the country, there are all sorts of odd regulations that prevent people from starting their own enterprise. And I think even if this may seem like small potatoes, these are important stories that we need to tell.
Well, and if I might, I mean, it's not small potatoes, and it's part of a bigger picture. These are barriers to entry, and that's what the liberals erect, barriers to entry. And we were just talking about minimum wage, that, and we're all clear, we need to help the working poor in terms of making ends meet and making sure that they can work and not encourage them to not work. But an increase, a federally mandated increase in the minimum wage is a barrier to entry to the workforce for those, as Arthur said, who most need to get into the workforce. These licenses, the mandates, the taxes, the regulations, they are erecting barriers. The fact that you cannot get into a good charter school in Virginia, it's very, very difficult. They've erected barriers to entry to charter schools, and we need to hold them accountable for that. We need to kind of capture the right language around it. But I remember your story in your book, Kristen, about the craft brewers and the distributors. It's a barrier to entry, and the left and the liberals and the government confer these monopolies essentially, and they're the ones who are actually more for big business than we're for small business, and we need to make that case more strongly, I think.
One note in defense of liberals, which is the first time you're going to hear that, and last today. I grew up among them. They are my tribe. They don't want to hurt poor people. There's no indication. And just like conservatives don't want to just give tax breaks to billionaires all the time. We're all doing the best we can. We're all looking for solutions to these big societal problems. And effectively, we're erecting barriers. I mean, a lot of progressive policies are erecting barriers. But a lot of conservatives, a lot of good, meat and potatoes Republicans are a bunch of crony capitalists, too, who are basically just trying to make sure that there's not very much competition at the high end of the business spectrum. And all of us have to, once again, conservatives and liberals, we can come together around the moral consensus, and I think this is the secret to making the system work better, the moral consensus that opportunity is something we should be pushing down to those who need it the most. Destroy everything that's in the way. And that means, by the way, if you're a conservative like me, you destroy barriers to faith and free expression of it, to family life as we traditionally understand it, to community that's not fragmented, and to work that doesn't have disincentives. Because faith, family, community, and work are the four secrets to success, and every conservative knows it. Destroy those barriers. Destroy barriers to equality, to social equality and social inclusion that liberals are hearing about the most. If we could be together on the idea of the destruction of barriers so that opportunity can flow down, then we really could have a real competition of ideas on left and right that wouldn't become this crazy holy war that winds up with shutdowns and gridlock all the time. Then we could actually kind of respect each other because we're kind of working for a lot of the same things.
Let's take some questions from the audience. Do we have any questions? Lady over there.
Thank you very much. I know, Dr. Brooks, that you have a lot of respect in Washington, and you've been doing consulting with candidates. And are you hopeful tomorrow night that you might see the fruits of your labor with any particular candidates?
I'm mostly fearful that I won't. AEI, I mean, obviously we're a nonpartisan place, a 501c3, and everybody who comes to us gets help. And we have Democrats and Republicans. I'm not on Hillary Clinton's speed dial, I won't lie. And more than half of the people who are going to be on the stage at both stages tomorrow have been through AEI and have tanked up on ideas, and we've talked about these types of things. I'm confident you're going to be hearing some of this. Now, there's a lot of sideshow activity going on. There's going to be, there's these subplots that are going on, and part of the reason that the press is so interested in this first debate is because of the carnival-like atmosphere that's accompanied the ascendancy of Donald Trump, obviously. But I do think that at least the second theme that we're going to see is going to be some of these more humanistic, more inclusive, more tolerant, more optimistic, more aspirational types of themes that we see from at least the other candidates. I'm very, very hopeful of that. Thank you.
Other questions? In the back, gentleman in the green shirt.
Kristen, this question's for you. I'm visiting, so I apologize for my dress. I was over in the lobby and they invited me in. But I work at a university and talk about the Millennium vote. My concern is the area I'm from. You talk about how many votes they're going to have up to 2075. Our students don't vote. And what do you need to do to get that 18-year-old to vote and get active in politics? Because I think in our area, that's what's lacking.
I think the first thing that folks need to do is show up and actually talk to young voters. President Obama did it. He did it. He made the effort to talk to young voters, and it paid dividends. The share of the electorate that is under the age of 30 had been falling from the very first year that the voting age was lowered to 18 when Richard Nixon won the youth vote. The share of voters under the age of 30 had been falling until you hit the era of around the late 2000s, and that number began to increase again. I think that young voters will play a huge role in this coming election. I think folks ignore the youth vote to their peril, not just for the long term, but also in the short term. And I think the problem is that for many politicians, they assume young voters won't vote. They don't realize that people under the age of 30 cast the same number of ballots as people 65 and older. They just don't realize that. It's just not their experience. And particularly for conservatives, going to college campuses is not always the most welcoming environment. And so sometimes they just prefer not to bother with that as much and to go places that they're comfortable. I think showing up first and foremost is something that conservatives need to get in the habit of doing. But also I think speaking, and showing up doesn't just mean physically showing up, it also means using new ways to communicate that don't just involve talk radio, broadcast television, but that actually involve being savvy about the use of technology to more effectively deploy a message. But second, you can't just deploy an old message through a new medium. And I think that's why I argue very strongly for the idea of taking timeless principles, but applying them to the challenges in young people's lives. I think right now, if I'm 24 years old, I don't know what a conservative plan is to make people my age have less college debt. I don't know what that is. That hasn't been clearly articulated. I believe it exists. I know it exists because Andrew Kelly at AEI has really great ideas about it. But if I'm just a 24-year-old who's just recently graduated from college, I probably don't know that yet. And I think it's up to these folks running to figure out how do their principles apply to these modern challenges, things that are not part of their life experience. Young people have been using Uber for a while now, and it's only just becoming something that, now we've got, Jeb Bush taking an Uber in San Francisco, and that's great. But I think we need more of that, more application of the timeless principles to the modern challenges that young people are facing that I think they rightly say politicians don't understand and don't care about.
Gentleman over there next to you.
Thank you, Dr. Brooks. My name is Clarence Mingo. I'm the elected county auditor for Franklin County, which is Columbus, Ohio. Republicans are outnumbered in Franklin County 3-1. So for every 3 Democrats, there's 1 Republican. Difficult to win in that county. 30% of Franklin County is African American, 70% are white. The question would be, many African Americans equate conservative thought or the idea of conservatism with white racism. I understand that's not true, but what is our message as conservatives to African Americans who draw out that type of equation, particularly in a county like Franklin?
Thank you. Are you're a Republican?
Yes, sir.
So you have particular challenges.
Unique challenges, yes.
And you are the answer to your own question. The Republicans are going to succeed when people see that we represent everybody and we are inclusive enough to have leadership that looks like everybody in the United States. And we're talking about women and Latinos and people with accents and African Americans and people with tattoos and people who are young and people who are really old and everything in between. Now, I've looked a lot at Latino voting. It's something I'm really interested in because of my family patterns. And what do you find? You find that Latinos vote at half the rate that blacks and whites do in America. So right now, you'll find that nearly 80% of blacks and whites will vote in a presidential election, but about 40 to 45% of Latinos will vote in a presidential election. If you look at the Latinos who vote, they vote way left. Those who don't vote but are eligible to vote, the other half, they're more likely to call themselves politically conservatives than whites in the United States. And you say, what's up with that? And the answer is they're demobilized. They're not going to vote for a Democrat, but they're not going to vote for a Republican either. Why? And when you do the public opinion polling on this, it's very clear. They feel alienated from the Republican Party because there aren't people like them and they don't feel welcome. Why is it that the Indian American community in the United States, there are 3 million Indian Americans in the United States today, the single most successful immigrant group in the history of our country, go 80-20 for the Democrat in presidential elections? The answer is because they perceive the Republican Party as unwelcome to them. They perceive the Republican Party as a middle-aged, white, male Christian party. They think that I was going to say it looks like me, but I don't look like a conservative either. The point is it looks like what they perceive as, the guys on the stage tomorrow night. That's a big problem. And so you're the answer. What we need is to reach out and to cultivate the kind of leadership that is truly inclusive. And the way you do that, by the way, is pretty simple too. And when I talk to Republican members of Congress, I say, when's the last time you went to an NAACP meeting? Well, they don't vote for me. I have limited time. No. Do you want to fight for people whether they vote for you or not? And the answer is, of course I do. What do patriots do? They don't fight for people who support them. They fight for people who need them. That's what patriots and leaders do. So go to an NAACP meeting and say, you might think I'm crazy, but you're not going to leave here tonight thinking I don't care. I'm going to fight for you and your family whether you vote for me or not. And then do it 6 more times until you get sticky. And guess what? You might peel off 5 percentage points of people who are willing to think for themselves in the African American community. And here's the basic math, by the way. 5 percentage points more of the African American community. So it's not 96% Democrat, it's 91% Democrat in presidential elections or whatever. 5% more of Latinos, 4% more of single women, 18 to 29s, and poor people, and it's game over. Republicans win. But then they have to deliver, and the only way they're going to deliver is if we see you and people who have your courage and your free thinking. Otherwise, generations from now, demography is going to be destiny, and it's not going to look good.
Can I put a little plug in for
Yep.
an organization I'm involved in with honorary chairman of the Republican State Leadership Committee. Chairman Cox and I have worked together to help elect state, house, and Senate candidates all across the country, lieutenant governors. And we have what we call the Future Majority Project, and we recruit candidates who more closely look like the voters we seek to serve. And so in my home state of Virginia, for example, I met today before coming out here with a candidate for the House of Delegates in Northern Virginia, Chong Nguyen, Vietnamese American. Danny Vargas is running in the district next to him. Puerto Rican, Sang Yi, Korean American, running in the district in Northern Virginia. And we will next year, we have one woman Republican state senator in the General Assembly. And next year, I predict to you, we will have 4. We'll quadruple the Virginia State Senate Republican Women's Caucus next year. But we are recruiting candidates, to Arthur's point, who look more like the people we seek to serve, and we're having a very positive impact in that regard. And last year elected 41 new Republicans to the State House around the country, who've never been elected before, who are African American, Asian American, or Hispanic, and about 121 new Republican women. We have 8 Republican women lieutenant governors in the country, more than the Democrats have, for example.
Let's take 2 more questions. This gentleman over here.
We got a mic coming.
Let me challenge your presumption, maybe. I think that there are a large group of people in the country who don't want to compete in the market. It's a scary idea for them. I think there are a lot of people who, frankly, would be content in more of a Soviet-style situation where big government, delivers a lot of goods. What is a conservative approach with that group? I mean, if you agree that there is such a group, I think there is. What's a conservative approach with that group? Do we negotiate basically a truce with them and minimize the amount of free stuff that they get? Or are you reaching out to try to change the attitude?
That's a great question. It's something that I've contemplated a lot. I didn't know my answer to that until I actually looked at the data. So this is not just theory or aspiration on my part. How do you, let's boil it down. How do you compete with free stuff because everybody likes free stuff, right? And you're never going to compete against the party of free stuff very well, right? I mean, that's the Republicans always lose the free stuff war is kind of what it comes down to. Okay. We faced this in the past. In the 1990s, in 1996, they were talking about welfare reform. And it was, Republicans are going to be really, really mean and reform welfare and put on time limits and work requirements, et cetera. And the Democrats were saying, no, you can't do that. It's not right. And the Republicans are going to lose because they were the eat your spinach party, right? Now, this was a really good thing that President Clinton did. I know he dragged his feet on this, but he signed the bill over the objections, and it was really courageous, over the objections of people in his party. Why? Because he had a commitment, as he said, to end welfare as we know it. And what we learned in that case is that you're not going to get everybody who has free stuff to say, yeah, I'm going to get rid of my free stuff. But you can get a society jointly to join hands and take aspiration over envy. You can do that. And here's basically the way it works. There are going to be a number of people who don't want to compete or are afraid to compete or can't compete. We have to solve the problem as much as we can by giving them as much opportunity as possible, but to give the rest of the population that doesn't want to hurt them permission to expose them to competition. See, here's how it works with the poor. Most people in America are not poor, but we all care about poor people. The reason that Republicans don't win in cases of poverty is because middle-class people who are not poor don't want to elect Republicans who are going to do something that's mean to those other people. If we offer aspiration to everybody and real opportunity to people, and we can convince the middle class in the United States that what we offer to the poor is a real solution, whether or not everybody wants to take it or not at once, we actually can have that aspirational agenda reign victorious in elections. And that's basically what the other key thing that I've noticed when I was writing this book, I was spending a lot of time in communities of poverty. I was tromping around slums in Asia, and I was walking around in homeless shelters in New York. And Marc and I were talking to homeless felons in New York, the most thrown away population of all. And I heard 0 people tell me, I would prefer to have my kids see me get a welfare check than a paycheck. The biggest mistake conservatives that make is the 47% mistake to say, poor people prefer to be dependent. They don't, but they don't feel like they have any opportunity. So we have to be, the problem is not that there's too much welfare in America, the problem is there's not enough opportunity in America, and so those are the 2 parallel problems, and I think that they can be solved. It's tricky, but we can do it.
One more question. This gentleman here.
To wind it back a little bit, you guys mentioned North Dakota and some of the economic changes that have taken place there and how they impact the country. And I hope everybody can sort of see that it's going to touch all 3 of you in different ways. I did business in Williston for quite a while and saw the development there, and oddly enough, sort of saw the tragedy there too. When you're up there, it was a town that had been a very small industrial town and grew very quickly, and every second store was either a liquor store or a strip bar. And that was really, other than the mines, that was the only thing that you saw there, the growth and the development in that area. And when I would talk to people who worked there, and as you said, the pay was unbelievable. People who were working were making hundreds of thousands of dollars of disposable income in 2 years. And what often happened is they would work there for 2 years and leave, buy a house, buy land, and say, I'm never going anywhere near Williston for the rest of my life. Because the natural growth you would expect with that sort of creation of a community just never happened. And I guess the question that I have for you, Dr. Brooks, is there an explanation maybe in the lack of mobility as to why the dollars you would have expected to go to that sort of area never really materialized and created a foundational community? And then from Ms. Anderson, how do we package the message of maybe a big part of this is the, while not preferred, comfortable nature of being able to secure a check without having to migrate and not come off as saying, you're a lazy bum, you don't care.
It's a great question, and it's self-evidently true that when you have a lot of guys who are footloose in a community with a lot of disposable cash, a lot of bad things are going to happen, for sure. Now, if I were a libertarian, I would say, strip clubs and liquor stores, what's your problem? Right, but I'm not a libertarian, so I'm not saying that. I understand the problem. And how do you impose moral order? By the way, here's the right ordering that we should be thinking about, just as a theoretical matter. Morals come before markets, always. Adam Smith knew that. We know that in our personal lives. And if we can't recognize that, we shouldn't call ourselves conservatives. Morals come before markets. How do you get more morals in a community? You get more morals by not just uprooting a bunch of guys and sending them there, guys in their 20s. When I was a kid in Seattle, guys would go up to canneries in Alaska and make really fast money, and the same things happened. And they would come back with wild stories, and we'd all wish we could go to the canneries in Alaska. So how do you solve this? By actually creating communities, by creating mobility of families. You need women who are married to the men and children in those communities, and suddenly you start, it's not perfect, but that's how every community can form. The Old West had the same problem. Every itinerant community winds up having the same problem, and it's only when you can induce the kind of migration where my great-grandparents went from Ohio to Colorado or something like that, could you get that sort of stability. So that's what I would suggest, and that's one more reason why you can't just say, free money. You actually have to get people to pick up and move.
I have almost never, in the course of my decade-long career of researching voters, encountered someone in a focus group who said their biggest dream in life was to make as much money as possible. That generally the thing that people are really looking for is they just want to feel like everything's going to be okay, that they can generally live the life that they want to, and most importantly, that the people they love are going to be okay as well. And I think too often, this actually is to a point that Arthur brought up earlier about the difference between materialists and moralists and how, we're the moralists that sometimes talk like materialists. I have heard people who will say, one of the reasons why I just don't understand conservatives and free markets is all that matters is wanting to just make more profits and profits and profits and profits, and that's everything. And that's why I think it's so important what Arthur has done here with this book, and I think this message is so important, that profits are not most people's highest aspiration. Most people don't actually want to be Donald Trump necessarily, or Bill Gates, to use other examples. I think most people want to live a life where they're able to maximize the amount of quality time they spend with people they love and doing things they find fulfilling. And I think to the extent that that's the outcome that we talk about our policies generating, rather than we're going to lead to 4% GDP growth or great profits, from a messaging perspective, as well as sort of how just our focus, I think understanding what people's aspirations are, and that when people's highest aspiration is, well, I just want to go to where I can make the most money, that's not the complete picture. And we should be talking about how our ideas serve the whole person.
I want to thank our panelists tonight. If you want to learn more, I would encourage you to get a copy of the Selfie Vote. Ed Gillespie has a book that was out a few years ago called, I think, Winning Right.
Winning Right.
Winning Right. And he's a novelist as well, I understand. He's working on a novel.
Aspiring
novelist. And of course, and I'm going to make a news announcement that Arthur Brooks doesn't even know yet, but his book will be number 9 on the bestseller list in the 3rd week since its publication. And I think everyone here can understand exactly why that is. So thank you, everybody, and thank you for coming tonight.
Thanks. Yeah, man. I wish you were in the Senate.